Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 231, The Invitation. Alex knew he didn't need to worry about Jason's insults. Instead, he looked at Jason and smiled. The Ferrari was pretty great. Do you remember how I tied you to it and the exhaust pipe singed your hair? He asked. Jason remembered it well. His heart started beating faster as he recalled that Alex had then gone on to defeat Fergus Plummer. Jason took a step back. "Shut up," he said, glaring at Alex with pure hatred. "I'll pay you back for everything you've done." "What's going on?" called a voice from the direction of the door. "What are you all doing here?" They turned to see Daryl standing there, looking tall and handsome in his black suit. Miriam stood next to him, wearing a black dress. Daryl and Miriam weren't happy to see Alex. They still felt humiliated after being forced to kneel to him in the lounge of the Olympic Sports Center. They had managed to suppress most of the idle chatter about the incident. But every once in a while, someone who had been there would shoot them a knowing look. If more people found out, Daryl's image would have been destroyed. Even now, Daryl was furious enough to kill Alex. "Why are you here?" Daryl asked, glaring at him. "Alex, you jerk!" Miriam screeched. "How dare you show your face around here?" She picked up a fork and hurled it at Alex, who raised his hand and batted it away. Everyone watched, gaping in shock. "Daryl, has this man offended you in some way?" someone asked. Miriam gestured angrily at Alex. "At the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games, this loser—" "Quiet," Daryl interrupted her. It was bad enough that he had been humiliated once. He didn't need Miriam telling everyone about it. "Sorry, Daryl," Miriam said, hanging her head. "I lost my temper and I nearly said too much." "How did he get in here?" Daryl asked, looking around at the others. "This is an exclusive party. Why has no one thrown him out?" "He must have been pretending to be a valet," Jason said, smirking at Alex. "Let's ask security to throw him out." The others agreed, calling out their opinions. "Yeah, let's get rid of this loser." "Let security deal with him." "No, we should lock him up somewhere until the party's over. We can't let him get away with everything he's done. It's time we got our revenge." Alex clenched his fists as he looked around at them. "I was invited by the Sultan of Brunei," he said. "What right do you have to drive me out of here?" Everyone was quiet for a moment, and then they all burst out laughing. Several of them pointed at him, jeering. "Invited by the Sultan of Brunei? Who does he think he is? Even David wasn't personally invited by the Sultan." "He's crazy. The Sultan would be more likely to invite a dog than someone like him." "I've never heard of anyone boast so outrageously before. Does he really expect us to believe this nonsense?" "The Sultan is due to arrive at any moment," Jason said. "Shall we get rid of this loser now?" "Absolutely," they all agreed, sneering as they approached Alex. Alex shook out his muscles, preparing to defend himself. Anyone who dared attack him would regret it. As they reached out to grab Alex, the door opened, and the Sultan entered, accompanied by some of the most prominent people in the city. Startled, Alex's attackers backed away, not wanting to make a bad impression. Alex spotted Nellie following the Sultan and several important-looking men in suits. The hall was crowded, and the Sultan didn't notice Alex. Miriam nudged Daryl. "Why is Nellie walking behind the Sultan?" Daryl shrugged. "Maybe the Sultan feels sorry for her," he suggested. After the Sultan had sat down, a city official stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," he said. "And I apologize for keeping you waiting, but I have some bad news. Unfortunately, Her Majesty, Queen Zora, has died. So let us observe a minute's silence as a mark of respect for the Queen." Nellie and the Sultan seemed grief-stricken, and Alex noticed that they both wore a small white flower pinned on their clothes as a mark of respect. After Zora's death, the Sultan and the main leaders of the city had agreed to suppress what had happened at the Westlake Guesthouse. To protect the reputation of both countries, they had simply announced that Zora had fallen gravely ill and had not recovered. Once the minute's silence had ended, the city government stepped forward. "The Sultan is ready to announce whether he will invest his $5 billion in Washington, D.C. or in New York. And I know that no matter the result, we will respect His Majesty's decision." The important families from Washington, D.C. all relaxed. Surely the governor was merely being polite. After all, if the Sultan had chosen to invest in New York, then this event would have been held there. They all smiled politely. The governor continued speaking. "The Sultan will announce the results after dinner." From her place beside the Sultan, Nellie looked over at Alex. When their eyes met, Nellie gave him a sad smile and then looked away. She's still grieving for Zora, Alex thought. Everyone began to eat. Alex had chosen a simple meal, causing the others to make fun of him. They nudged each other and snickered, rolling their eyes. "School meals are always such poor quality," Colin said, looking over at Alex. "You'd think a student would take the chance to eat better when they're in the best hotel in Washington, D.C. "Yes, he's lowering the whole tone of the place," Jason said. He turned to Alex. "Didn't you say that the Sultan invited you? Well, he's right over there, so why don't we ask him?" Alex smiled. "Go right ahead." "Oh, such a brave man," Jason said. "If the Sultan hadn't arrived when he did, we would have driven you out." The others nodded their agreement. Daryl pointed at Alex with his fork. "Alex, as you can see, all the most important people in the city are here," he said. "When the banquet is over, we'll tell them about you gate-crashing this event. And what do you think they'll do to you then?" Everyone laughed and taunted Alex. "Let's see you survive in the city when its leaders are against you." "As soon as the meal's over, we'll report this loser and let the authorities deal with him." "See how calm he looks? I hope he enjoys his meal. After all, it might be his last." Alex didn't take them seriously and simply continued to eat. The Sultan was still mourning the death of his wife, but as the leader of a nation, he had to continue working to advance his country's interests. The investment of $5 billion had been planned for some time, and he had to see it through. He sat at a table, trying to hide his heartbreak, while he spoke with the city leaders. He glanced around and spotted Alex sitting at another table. When Zora had been dying, she had asked him to take care of Nellie and her friends, so the Sultan wanted to see Alex before returning home. Daryl, Miriam, Colin, and Jason saw the Sultan looking in their direction. Surprised, they sneaked glances at him as they whispered to each other. Do you think the Sultan wants us to be involved with his investment? Yeah, maybe. That would be great. Hey, I can't see the Sultan from here. What's he doing? Is he still looking at our table? The Sultan spoke in Malay to one of his bodyguards, asking him to invite Alex to join him. A moment later, the bodyguard walked toward Alex's table. The Sultan has sent someone over, Jason whispered. Is he going to invite us to sit at his table? But there isn't room enough for all of us. I think the Sultan wants to invite one of us to join him, Colin said. Look at his expression. He seems to be very interested in us. The others agreed, everyone talking at once. Yes, the Sultan must want to invite one of us, but who? It must be Jason. His family works in the internet industry, and Brunei needs to upgrade their networks. I think it's Colin. Maybe the Sultan is looking for a suitable husband for his daughter. It must be Colin. Miriam hugged Daryl's arm and said, I think it's Daryl. He's already made a very good impression on the Sultan. Perhaps he wants to say goodbye to Daryl before he leaves. Episode 232, The Medal of Honor. Everyone watched the bodyguard's progress, waiting to see what would happen and hoping he was coming to speak to them. The bodyguard smiled as he walked over to stand beside Alex and Daryl. The others slumped into their seats, realizing that the Sultan hadn't asked for them. Daryl was the lucky one, and they were all extremely envious. Daryl felt like he had won the lottery, and he could barely contain his grin. He thought, even though I only spoke with the Sultan for a few minutes, I must have impressed him. The bodyguard bent down to Alex, said something in Malay, and then gestured toward the Sultan. Alex understood that the Sultan wished Alex to join him. He didn't want to sit at the Sultan's table, but he couldn't refuse, so he got up and followed the bodyguard. Everyone was stunned. They hadn't expected Alex to be invited to sit with the Sultan. They stared at the Sultan's table, waiting for someone to realize the bodyguard had fetched the wrong person. But nothing happened, and they didn't know what to think. The Sultan is a very pious and charitable man, Daryl said, flushing with embarrassment. He must have noticed how poor Alex is and felt sorry for him. The others murmured their agreement. They couldn't believe the Sultan wanted to speak to Alex. Several of them offered their opinions. Exactly. The Sultan feels sorry for him. Alex clearly doesn't belong there. I bet he has no idea what to say to such important people. He's probably terrified. I think the Sultan wants to set Alex up on a blind date. To see that ugly girl beside him? Don't you think she's perfect for Alex? They all snorted with laughter. The Sultan welcomed Alex to his table. He asked the city government to give up his seat, and then he talked to Alex, with Nellie acting as their interpreter. He completely ignored the governor and all the other important people. Alex offered the Sultan his condolences, and the Sultan nodded, his expression gloomy. After a few seconds, he said through Nellie, Alex, you were my wife's student, and I wish to grant you a favor. Come back to Brunei with me, and I will make you a senior official with a salary of $5 million a year. Alex was surprised. Thank you for your kindness, he said, bowing his head. But I don't wish to leave my own country. And despite how I'm dressed, I'm not short of money. Nellie stared at him. Instead of interpreting for the Sultan, she whispered to Alex, If you go with the Sultan, you'll never have to worry about anything ever again. Do you really want to refuse his offer? Alex nodded. Nellie looked at him and sighed, and then she interpreted Alex's words for the Sultan. The Sultan looked at Alex and thought, What an honorable young man. He reached out and patted Alex's arm with affection. The city leaders were impressed that Alex had refused the Sultan's generous offer, but no one could understand why the Sultan thought so highly of him. The Sultanate, considering what else he could do for Alex, then had an idea pop into his mind. He turned to the governor and spoke in Malay. Nellie interpreted. "Governor, the Sultan wishes to present the Brunei National Medal of Honor to one of the guests, and then he will announce his decision about the $5 billion investment." The city leaders were thrilled with the idea. "Okay, that's no problem," the governor said. "Tell me, who is to be the recipient of the award?" He looked around the hall at all the important families. The Sultan hesitated. He wanted to present the medal to Alex, but the governor expected him to give it to someone else. Now, if he gave it to Alex, the governor might be offended. The Sultan claimed he didn't have anyone specific in mind, and that the idea had just come to him when he had looked around at everyone. The governor nodded. "Yes, of course," he said. "The Sultan doesn't know many people in the city, so each family should send forward a representative, and then the Sultan can make a decision." The Sultan agreed. The guests were all excited. They knew how prestigious the award was, and each family began to discuss who should represent them. Almost 20 families selected someone to put forward. Most of them chose young people in their 20s, but a few chose the head of their family. The Sultan asked his men to fetch the National Medal of Honor. The medal was in a blue box, and it was an octagonal shape, with the head of the founder of Brunei in the middle, surrounded by petals and inlaid with a ring of sparkling diamonds. The governor held up his hands and said, "Now, each representative will make a brief statement, and then the Sultan will decide who gets the medal." The Sultan didn't listen to any of the statements. When they were finished, he patted Alex on the shoulder and asked him to speak. No one understood what was going on. Surely the Sultan wouldn't award the medal to a lowly pancake seller. When Alex stood, everyone covered their mouths, trying not to laugh. They didn't dare disrespect the Sultan. But the Sultan noticed he wasn't pleased. "I'm just an ordinary man," Alex said. "I work to pay for my tuition and living expenses, and this summer I spent 2 months selling pancakes." A few members of the audience laughed. Others murmured to each other, "He can't compete with us." "He doesn't really think he'll get the medal, does he?" "The Sultan just feels sorry for him." The Sultan asked Nellie what the people were saying, and when he found out, he scowled. The audience noticed the Sultan's expression and thought Alex's speech had made him angry, so they continued to talk. "Look at the Sultan's face. This loser is offending him. If he messes up this investment, I'll kill him." The governor asked the Sultan to come to the stage. Then he stood in front of the Sultan, holding the box containing the medal. All eyes were on them as everyone waited to hear their name being announced. The king spoke in Malay. Then he fetched Alex and led him onto the stage. Nellie interpreted for him. "The Sultan wishes to present this National Medal of Honor to Alex." There was a great uproar. No one could understand why the Sultan had awarded the medal to such a loser. They all considered themselves far superior to Alex. So what had the Sultan been thinking? They just couldn't believe it. Confused, they all began to speak at once. "Him? Why?" "All of the best families are here, and none of us were chosen. How could this happen?" "How could the top 20 families in Washington, D.C. have lost to a kid who sells pancakes?" "We can't let that loser be presented with that medal. Our families would be humiliated. Episode 233, Rumors, Apologies, and Decisions. Daryl stood up. "Your Majesty," he said to the Sultan, "you should know that this young man snuck into this banquet without an invitation, and he is of questionable moral character." Alex is a loser, Daryl thought. So the Sultan won't be angry with me for speaking out. People from the other families backed Daryl's statement. "He claimed that you invited him here. He's a car thief. Alex has a terrible reputation. He cheated people out of their money, and he's probably here to do it again." Daryl nudged Miriam, who understood what he wanted. She stood up and said to the Sultan, "Your Majesty, I went to school with Alex, and he cost me a place at a good university. And then a while ago, he humiliated me at a restaurant." Nellie interpreted everything for the Sultan and told him that none of it was true. The Sultan had known Nellie for over 10 years, so he trusted her opinion. He looked at these people from important families and was disgusted by their behavior. He spoke through Nellie. "Who told you he snuck in? He's telling the truth. I invited him." Everyone had expected the Sultan to have Alex driven out, and now they looked at each other in shock. The Sultan continued to speak, with Nellie interpreting. "I invited Alex because he was my deceased wife's student. I know he's a good man, so I don't want to hear any more rumors about him." Everyone was stunned. How had Alex known the Queen? It was clear the Sultan had loved his wife very much, so no wonder the king had invited Alex to the banquet. They began to fidget as they realized they had slandered Alex and angered the Sultan, possibly costing their city a lot of money. Miriam glanced at Daryl. "Does that mean I shouldn't insult Alex now?" she asked. Daryl was upset. Miriam's question reminded him of his own stupid mistake. He glared at her, and she looked away. Through Nellie, the Sultan asked, "Are there any more objections to Alex receiving the medal?" Everyone shook their heads. They didn't dare interfere at the Sultan's choice. The Sultan pinned the Medal of Honor on Alex's chest and said in Malay, "I present you with the Brunei National Medal of Honor. This medal will ensure you will always be warmly welcomed in my country. It also commands respect throughout the world, so any insult to you is also an insult to Brunei." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Alex said, touching the medal and bowing to the Sultan. The Sultan patted Alex's shoulder. "My queen was very fond of you," he said, with Nellie interpreting. "And that means that you are practically family." He saw the governor standing at the side, and he knew everyone was waiting for him to announce where he would invest his $5 billion. He had planned to visit both cities, but he had stayed in Washington, D.C. for over 10 days, and he had not yet visited New York. He would be returning home the next day, so he had decided to simply invest the money in Washington, D.C. But after the way these people had treated Alex, he wasn't so sure. He looked at Alex. "You've spent time in both New York and Washington, D.C., he said in Malay. "Where do you think I should invest?" "Your Majesty, that's your decision," Alex said, shaking his head. He wasn't comfortable making decisions with other people's money. The Sultan smiled. "My decision is that you should decide," Nellie said, interpreting for him. "I'll invest wherever you say." Everyone was panicked. They couldn't believe that the Sultan would let Alex choose. Was this a joke? After the way they had treated Alex, he was bound to find in favor of New York. Nellie looked around. She pulled Alex aside and whispered, Advise the Sultan to invest in New York. These people don't deserve any of the money. Alex sighed. They were talking about $5 billion, so he couldn't let the Sultan make a poor investment simply because of Alex's resentment. He turned to the Sultan and asked if he had any preferences for what sorts of businesses he wanted the money to be invested in. The Sultan said he hoped the investment could be concentrated in real estate, the service industry, and tourism. These were all important within Brunei, so he had a particular interest in them. Alex nodded, gave it some thought. No one dared to blink or look away. They stared at Alex, waiting for his decision. The city leaders watched him with worried expressions. Alex stroked his chin as he considered the matter. As the son of an important family, he had learned about business dealings from a young age. He had bought several properties, and he had a good understanding of the business environment in New York. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. was more focused on technology. If the Sultan had expressed an interest in industries such as telecommunications or artificial intelligence, then Washington, D.C. would be more suitable. But the Sultan had said he wanted to invest in real estate, the service industry, and tourism. Both cities had a strong tourism industry, but New York had the edge in the other two industries. New York was also the economic center of the United States, and it had a much larger population than Washington, D.C. Alex raised his eyes. When he noticed everyone staring at him, he got a little nervous. People from the big families smiled at him, silently urging him to choose Washington, D.C. Alex snorted and then turned back to the Sultan. "Have you made your decision?" the Sultan asked through Nellie. Alex nodded. He had just opened his mouth when someone called out, "Alex, I apologize for our behavior. Please forgive me." Others joined in. "I'm sorry too. You were invited by His Majesty, and we were wrong to suggest otherwise." "Those people slandered you, and I joined in because I was confused." "We should never have listened to those idiots. Please don't be angry with us." If the Sultan invested in New York, then no one here would benefit from it. Everyone looked at Daryl, Colin, and Jason. They were the ones who had insulted Alex the most. So if the city missed out on the money, it would be all their fault. The city leaders began to call them out. "Colin, Daryl, Jason, please apologize to Alex." "Yes, apologize now. If you hadn't spread those rumors, we would never have slandered Alex. You should beg for his forgiveness." Colin, Daryl, and Jason were humiliated at being singled out in front of everyone. Yes, they had insulted Alex, but they hadn't forced anyone to join in. Why should they take all the blame? That wasn't fair. But despite their anger, they knew how important it was to secure the $5 billion for the city. If Washington, D.C. lost the money now, then they could never show their faces in public again. They walked over to Alex, bowed their heads, and apologized. "Alex, we were wrong before. We shouldn't have spread those rumors about you." "We're sorry for our mistake." "Please don't let our behavior affect the Sultan's investment. The city has worked so hard for this." Finally, they all said, "Please, forgive us." "Okay," Alex said, nodding at them. "I forgive you." All the members of the big families breathed a sigh of relief, and Daryl, Colin, and Jason felt their tension melt away. Miriam went over to Daryl. "Don't worry," she said, keeping her voice low. "I know Alex. If he's forgiven you, then he won't cause any more trouble." Daryl looked at Alex. At least we've saved the investment, he thought. We'll deal with Alex another time. Nellie elbowed Alex and glared at him. "Idiot," she muttered. Alex ignored everyone and turned to the Sultan. "Your Majesty," he said, "I've thought it over, and I think you should invest the money in New York." Episode 234, The Competition. Everyone was stunned. Even though they had just apologized for their poor behavior toward him, Alex had advised the Sultan to invest his money in New York. The important guests stood there, their smiles frozen and their hearts pounding. A few people collapsed into their chairs, their mouths hanging open. Colin's mind was spinning. If the investment had gone to Washington, D.C., then his family would probably have received part of the money, and they would have been able to expand their business. But now they would get nothing. Daryl gaped in shock, trying to understand what had happened. "Are you okay?" Miriam asked, noticing how pale he looked. Daryl barely heard her. He was too busy glaring at Alex, wishing he could incinerate him on the spot. Nellie gave Alex a thumbs up. "Well done," she muttered. When the city leaders recovered from the shock, they pleaded with Alex and the Sultan. "Alex, please reconsider." "You've accepted our apology, so can't you let it go?" "Your Majesty, this is your investment. You should be the one to decide." Alex tried to explain his decision to the Sultan. "Your Majesty, New York has a much larger population than—" The Sultan raised his hand, signaling Alex to stop. "It doesn't matter," he said through Nellie. "You said New York, so I will invest in New York." Alex smiled. "Thank you for your trust," he said. "I'm certain your investment in New York will double in value within 10 years. The matter was settled, and the important families and city officials stopped arguing. They were furious, but nobody dared to complain in front of the Sultan. The Sultan knew his guests were upset, so he decided to finish the meal as soon as possible. He stood on the stage and made a short speech, and then the governor announced the end of the banquet. As the Sultan prepared to leave, he asked Alex to walk outside with him. Once the Sultan had left, everyone began to speak at once, insulting both the Sultan and Alex. Everyone threatened to get revenge on Alex at the first opportunity. Outside, the Sultan said goodbye to Alex and got into a limousine. Alex asked Nellie, "Are you going back home with the Sultan?" Nellie shook her head. "I ran away from the Queen and came to the United States to find someone," she said. "And now that the Queen is gone, there's nothing for me in Brunei. I'm going to stay here and look for that person. They're very special to me. Besides, even if I don't find him, I prefer being here with you, even if you are kind of a loser." Alex smiled at her. Nellie blushed. "Are you laughing at me?" she asked, stretching out her hand to smack the back of his head. "Don't make fun of me." She stuck her tongue out at him and got into the limousine, and then she left with the Sultan. A few days later, David and Leona's families were busy preparing for the wedding. David wanted to recruit some extra security for the wedding ceremony. After all, the Drake family was important, so they required more than simple bodyguards. They needed skilled people who could provide protection and carry out a few discreet tasks. Most of the powerful families had such security experts. It was expensive, but it was well worth it. Strong security is a deterrent to anyone plotting against them, and it allowed the families to feel confident. According to David's research, 10 martial artists might be suitable. All 10 were currently staying in hotels in Washington, D.C. David wanted to test their skills before he made any decision, so he invited them all to the family house. It was a luxurious villa with extensive grounds, which included a garden, an open-air swimming pool, and a large garage. They employed many servants to keep the villa in good condition. At 10 o'clock in the morning, all 10 martial artists arrived. David looked them over. They were both men and women, and they all looked quite different from each other. Some were taller than others, and some were more heavily built. Some of them looked extremely unfit, and David wasn't sure what to think. He was surprised by their looks, but he still needed to test them and see how good they were. "Please come with me to the garden," he said, "and let's see what you can do." The 10 martial artists followed David to the garden and found 20 people waiting for them. All 20 were well-built and impressive-looking. One of the martial artists, a middle-aged man with a thin face, sneered. "See how much effort David has put into testing us?" he asked. "He's gathered all these strong young men to fight us." Several of the others laughed. David frowned. "I may be your employer soon," he thought. "You should show me some respect." Then again, martial arts people are normally quite arrogant even with their employers. "Please don't take offense," he said to the 10 martial arts experts. "These men are all members of an elite combat team, but I assume you'll be able to deal with them. One of you against 5 of them?" A few of the martial arts experts laughed. "Is that the best you could find?" "Only 5 at a time? You underestimate us. I won't even work up a sweat." The members of the elite combat team were furious at the lack of respect. Some of them clenched their fists, ready to beat the strange-looking people who were insulting them. David was pleased to see how spirited they were. "I like the confidence," he said. "Which of you wants to be the first to compete?" The elite combat team members held their heads high, looking forward to getting started. They couldn't wait to teach these upstarts a lesson. "I'll go first," said one man, stepping forward. It was the middle-aged man who had sneered at the elite team. "I'm Ryder Dixon. I'll take on 10 of your little team." David clapped his hands. "Okay," he said. "If Ryder wants to fight 10 men at once, then I won't stop him. I can't wait to see what he'll do." The leader of the elite team selected 10 of his men, who walked up to Ryder. The others stepped back to make more room. "We won't be going easy on you," the leader warned Ryder. He turned to his men and said, "Attack as a group." The 10 men rushed right at Ryder, who merely smiled. As they got close, he jumped out of the way, hitting one of the men with one hand. The man grunted as he hit the ground. Ryder continued to make circular motions with his hands, waiting for a chance to hit another of his opponents. The 10 members of the elite team appeared slow and clumsy compared to Ryder. No matter what they did, they never came close to touching him. Ryder moved along the elite team members, knocking each of them down one by one. In less than 3 minutes, all 10 men had been sent sprawling. They held their hands over their injuries, staring at Ryder with fear. The other martial artists watched Ryder with respect. "Good," David said, walking over to Ryder. "You're certainly very skilled. The Drake family could use a man like you." Ryder snorted. "We'll see," he said, nodding at David and going back to stand with the others. The next fighter was called Marco Moreno. Like Ryder, he defeated 10 of the elite team, but it took him a little longer, and his skills were not quite as good as Ryder's. David was happy with how well they were performing, But now that his 20 men had been beaten by Ryder and Marco, there was no one left to test the rest of the fighters. He considered it for a moment and then came up with an idea. "The rest of you will fight against Ryder and Marco," he said. "After that, Ryder and Marco will rest, and another 2 of you will take their place. Let me see how skilled you are." Episode 235, The Unexpected Winner. The rest of the fighters agreed, and 2 of the martial artists went out to spar with Ryder and Marco. Every move was perfect, and they were much better than David's elite team. David nodded repeatedly as he watched them fight, satisfied with their abilities. As soon as the men had finished fighting, 2 others stood up. One of them, Damien, looked very ordinary and seemed confident. The other, Rick, looked really rough and gave the impression of being cunning. Damien introduced himself to David, and then he turned to the 2 men who would be fighting with them. "Forgive me if I damage you too badly," he said in a loud voice. Everyone was shocked by Damien's arrogance. The 2 fighters snorted. "Quit flapping your gums and get on with it," one of them called. Rick sneered at the 2 men. "Don't say we didn't warn you," he said. Damien and Rick burst into action. Having studied martial arts for years, they were highly skilled, and they had made a fortune by providing security for powerful families. Unfortunately, they had spent all their money and no longer had enough to live on. They had heard that the Drake family in Washington, D.C. was looking for martial arts experts to act as security guards. The salary had been reported to be extremely generous, so they had rushed here to apply for the position. Damien and Rick battled vigorously, and their skills were obvious. They fought well together, forming an impressive team, and right from the beginning, they were in control. The other 2 men were beaten easily. Rick punched his opponent, who fell to the ground, gasping for breath. At the same time, Damien defeated his opponent. The whole fight had taken less than 2 minutes. Everyone watched, knowing that they were no match for Damien and Rick. "Does anyone else want to challenge us?" Rick asked, looking around. No one spoke. Although none of them liked Ryder and Marco, they knew they couldn't beat them, so they didn't dare say anything. David walked over to Damien and Rick. "Clearly these 2 men have outstanding skills," he said. "So I'm offering them a place in my security team." He turned to the 2 men. "Will you accept?" "As long as the money's good," said Rick, shrugging. "If you pay us well enough, we'll work for you." Someone coughed loudly, drawing attention. A middle-aged, slightly plump man stepped forward. Rick looked him up and down, clearly unimpressed. "Do you have a problem?" he asked. "Are you challenging me?" The man nodded, a small smile playing around his lips. Everyone gaped at him in surprise. Did the man have a death wish? Rick could kill him with a single blow. Rick stared at him. "Since you're so determined to die, then I'll grant your wish," he said. He clenched his fist and rubbed it against the palm of his other hand. Then he stepped forward, raised his hand, and swung at the man's face. The man simply stood there smiling and didn't even try to move out of the way. But before Rick's fist could make contact, Rick screamed and dropped to the ground. Everyone had been watching Rick's hand as it flew toward the man's face, so they hadn't seen the man kick out at Rick's leg. Rick lay on the ground, clutching his knee. He lifted his head and looked at the man. "It's you," Rick exclaimed, looking horrified. "Ah, so you do remember me," the man said. "I thought you might have forgotten." 4 years ago, Damien and Rick had arrived in a new city. No one had been able to match their fighting abilities, and they had been filled with pride. One day they had visited a brothel, looking for a little fun, and they had burst into a room, disturbing the occupants. The man had then stood up, turned his back on them, and hurriedly gotten dressed. Damien and Rick had spotted the man's uniform and had realized that he was a security guard for one of the important families, who would have not approved of their employees visiting such a place. They had attacked the man, intending to beat him, but they hadn't expected him to be so skilled in martial arts. They hadn't been able to defeat him, and the man had injured them quite badly. The man had kept his face hidden from them, afraid that exposure would destroy his reputation. Once he had dealt with Rick and Damien, the man had turned around to leave. But then the prostitute had called out, "Cliff Munson, you haven't paid me." The man had scowled, annoyed that his name had been revealed. He had taken out a stack of money and thrown it at her. Without turning around, Cliff had spoken to Damien and Rick. "If you even think about telling people about this, I will make you pay." With that, he had walked out of the room. Damien and Rick had never been defeated before they had met Cliff, and they had been in awe of him. Rick stared at Cliff. "Mr. Munson," he said. "I'm sorry. If I'd known it was you, I would have never offended you." Damien also apologized. "Please, forgive us. We didn't mean to disrespect you." Some of the others recognized Cliff's name, and they were surprised to see him there. They stared at him in amazement, knowing they could never match his strength. Cliff smiled. "Since you've admitted your mistakes, I'll let it go," he said, taking a small jar out of his pocket and throwing it at Rick. "Use this. It'll help with the bruising." Damien helped Rick up, keeping an eye on Cliff. David shook Cliff's hand and said, "I think you've shown that you have superior fighting skills, and my family would be pleased to have you work for us." He was aware of Cliff's reputation, and he had been impressed when he had taken Rick down so easily. Cliff nodded to David. "Thank you, Mr. Drake," he said. "My previous employer has let me go, so I've been looking for a new position. If I'm treated well, then I'm willing to commit myself to the safety of your family." Everyone was shocked that anyone would fire someone as experienced as Cliff. But 6 months ago, Cliff's secret trips to the brothel had been revealed, and the head of the family he had worked for had told him to leave. He had wandered aimlessly for a while, and then, when he had learned of David's intention to hire more security, he had decided to come to Washington, D.C. David was thrilled. "I promise that, for as long as you work for the Drake family, you will have a comfortable life. I'll need to speak with my father to determine the specific salary, but do we have an agreement?" Cliff was satisfied. "That sounds good," he said, nodding. "I will work for the Drake family." David clapped his hands and said, "Well, that's settled." He turned to the other martial artists. "I was also impressed by your abilities, so there are positions here for you if you want them." He paused. "Of course, your salary will be lower than Cliff's." The martial artists had come to Washington, D.C. to seek employment, so they nodded their agreement. David looked around at his new security guards. Their first order would be to deal with that loser Alex. David was busy with his upcoming wedding, but when that was over, it would be time to get rid of Alex once and for all.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.